In the vacuum of space, where silence reigned supreme, the research vessel Aegis floated near the surface of a desolate alien moon. The viewports framed a barren landscape, marked only by craters and faint glimmers of unnatural light. The crew of the Aegis had come here searching for answers. What they found would change the course of their mission, and their lives. Inside the Aegis, a quiet unease had settled over the team. Dr. Arden Cross, the expedition's lead scientist, stared at the flickering monitor in front of her. On it, a faint, pulsing glow drew patterns that defied conventional understanding. "We've never seen anything like this before," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Her breath fogged the glass of her face shield as she double-checked her suit's seals. "It's not natural. It's not a mineral. It's not anything we can identify." Behind her, Commander Teller rested a hand on his sidearm, a gesture more out of habit than necessity. "That doesn't sound comforting," he said dryly. "If you don't know what it is, maybe we shouldn't be poking it." Arden turned, her features illuminated by the eerie light from the screen. "If we don't poke it, we'll never understand it. And if we leave without understanding it, we're just kicking the can down the road. Someone else will find it eventually, maybe someone less careful." Teller grunted in response but didn't argue further. He knew Arden's determination well, too well. She had a reputation for never leaving questions unanswered. The other crew members busied themselves checking equipment and running scans, their movements brisk but deliberate. The air in the cabin was thick with anticipation. Outside, under the harsh glow of the ship's floodlights, a small landing party prepared to retrieve the object. The moon's surface offered no signs of life, no structures, no evidence that anyone, or anything, had been there before. Just the object, sitting at the bottom of a shallow depression, pulsing faintly with its inscrutable rhythm. Dr. Elric Vane, the team's geologist, stepped cautiously down the ramp of the landing pod. "Radiation levels are within tolerable limits," he reported. "But there's something else. I'm picking up. I don't know how to describe it. It's not just electromagnetic. It's something else." Arden's voice crackled over the comm. "Be specific, Elric. What are you seeing?" "I'm not sure. It's like the instruments are detecting something that's not quite there. A ghost signal. Nothing on the standard spectrums." "Could be interference," another crew member chimed in. "Or a sensor malfunction." "Not a malfunction," Elric replied firmly. "I've triple-checked. Whatever it is, it's not normal." As the team neared the object, the atmosphere shifted. The light seemed to bend around the substance, casting shadows that didn't align with the angles of the floodlights. Arden watched the feed intently, her heart beating faster with each step the team took closer to the thing. She wasn't afraid, she was fascinated. But the unease in her chest wouldn't subside. When Elric finally stood before the object, he hesitated. "It's more beautiful than I expected," he said. His voice was almost reverent, like a whisper in a cathedral. The substance was small, about the size of a football, but it shimmered with layers of color that no one had ever seen before. Blues that weren't quite blue, reds that seemed to shift into a spectrum beyond human vision. It was mesmerizing. Elric reached out, but stopped just short of touching it. "Arden, are you seeing this? The way it's almost breathing?" "I see it," Arden replied. "Don't touch it. Just take the readings. Record everything. We need to know what we're dealing with before we risk direct contact." But the object seemed almost alive. Its pulse quickened, the colors shifting faster. Elric's hand twitched as if drawn by an unseen force. "I don't think it wants to be left alone," he said, barely audible. "Step back, Elric," Arden ordered. "Right now." As Elric moved to comply, the pulse stopped. For a brief moment, everything was still, too still. No hum from the equipment. No faint winds on the moon's surface. Just an unnatural, heavy silence. Then, the light from the object flared, bright and blinding. Every monitor aboard the Aegis went dark. Communication lines crackled with static before cutting out entirely. Arden's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to reconnect the feed. What just happened? Elric, respond. There was no answer. The silence on the comm was as oppressive as the silence outside. Then, faintly, through the static, it's not just an object, Elric said. His voice trembled. It's something more. I think we woke it up. And then the line went dead. Back aboard the Aegis, the crew scrambled to regain their connection. Arden's fingers flew across the console, inputting commands to reboot the communication link. Static buzzed in her earpiece, rising and falling, a tantalizing hint of Elric's voice buried deep in the distortion. The monitor before her flickered, cycling through interference patterns that made no sense, shapes and symbols that didn't align with any known language or signal type. Can someone tell me what's going on out there? Teller barked, his usually calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. We've got no visuals, no data streams. Is anyone getting anything? Another crew member, Nora, shook her head. It's not just communications. The containment protocols just triggered themselves. Systems are locking down one by one. Locking down? Arden turned sharply toward her. Why? I don't know. The ship's treating the object like it's a Category Omega hazard, but that makes no sense. We haven't even brought it aboard yet. Arden clenched her jaw. We need eyes on Elric and the landing party. Get me a manual override on those visual feeds. I'm trying, but the system's not responding, Nora said, her hands dancing over her terminal. Then try harder, Teller growled. We can't just sit here blind. In the eerie silence, a low hum began to resonate through the ship, not from the speakers but from the very walls. It was a sound that seemed to reach into their chests and vibrate in their bones, a feeling rather than a noise. The lights flickered, casting unsettling shadows that appeared to shift when no one was looking directly at them. Arden, Nora's voice was a hushed whisper. This doesn't feel right. It's like the ship is reacting. Stay focused, Arden said, her voice steadier than she felt. It's just residual interference. We've encountered weird EM fields before. Nora hesitated. Not like this. Arden knew she was right. This was unlike anything they had ever seen. She just didn't want to say it out loud. The strange resonance wasn't just in the walls, it was in their bodies, their thoughts. The whole ship felt off, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, one of the monitors lit up with a distorted image. Arden and the others froze, staring at the screen. It was a blurry, shifting view of the landing site. The camera must have reactivated, partially. The view was grainy, warped, but it showed enough. Elric was still there, standing just a few feet from the glowing object. His posture was rigid, his face obscured by his helmet's visor. And the object, it had changed. It's growing, Arden whispered. The glowing substance now pulsed faster, spreading tendrils of light across the lunar surface. It looked less like a solid object and more like a living, growing mass. It was as if it had begun to wake up, stretching, expanding, sensing. Elric, come in. Teller barked into his comm, get back to the pod immediately. There was a pause, then a crackling response. It's beautiful, Elric said, his voice distant, almost mesmerized. I think it's singing. Can't you hear it? Arden's stomach turned. Elric, listen to me. You need to move away from it. That's an order. Elric didn't answer. Instead, his hand reached toward the object. On the screen, the light intensified. The image flickered again, and for a split second, Arden thought she saw something. A shape, a figure in the light. Then it was gone. Elric! Stand down. Do not touch it. Arden shouted. But the feed went dark again, leaving the team in a state of stunned silence. Arden's mind raced. What had she just seen? Was it a glitch? A trick of the light? Or had the object, or whatever it was, revealed something more? We've lost him, Nora said quietly. No, Arden snapped. He's still out there. We just need to re-establish. Arden, we've got another problem, Teller interrupted. He pointed to a different console, where warning lights flashed in rapid succession. The object's energy field is growing. If it continues at this rate, then what? Then it'll engulf the pod. Maybe more. Arden forced herself to think clearly. We need to bring him back. The longer he's exposed, the more dangerous this gets. Teller, prep a retrieval team. Teller didn't look convinced. We don't even know what we're dealing with. If we go down there, we might just make things worse. Worse than losing a crew member? Worse than letting that thing continue to grow unchecked? Arden said, her voice cutting through the doubt. We're not leaving him out there. Teller hesitated, then nodded. Fine. But we're taking every precaution. Full hazard protocols. If this thing can affect our systems and our people, it won't stop us from doing the right thing, Arden interrupted. Now move. Teller headed toward the airlock, barking orders to a small team. Arden stayed behind at the console, desperately trying to restore full visuals. She couldn't shake the image she'd seen earlier, of light, of motion, of something she couldn't quite describe. If Elric was still alive out there, she needed to find him. And if the object was what she feared it might be, she needed to know before it was too late. As Teller and the retrieval team suited up, the tension aboard the Aegis was palpable. Every crew member could feel it, an intangible pressure, as though the ship itself was warning them not to proceed. But Arden ignored it. She had to. If she hesitated, if she let her fear take hold, they would lose Elric, and perhaps much more. Check comms again, she ordered, her voice sharp but steady. I want constant contact this time. We're trying, but something's still blocking the signal, Nora said, her tone tight with frustration. We've only got fragments of audio coming through. It's like there's a field jamming everything. Then switch frequencies. Use short bursts if you have to, Arden snapped. She caught Teller's eye. You're not going down blind. Teller nodded. He was already inside his bulky hazard suit, a helmet visor reflecting the faint glow of the overhead lights. We'll find him, he said. Whatever it takes. Just be careful. And if that thing starts reacting again, get out. Don't engage it. Just bring him back. With a grunt of acknowledgement, Teller motioned to his team. The hatch to the airlock slid open, and the group moved inside, sealing the door behind them. Arden watched the status indicators on her console, tracking their progress as the outer hatch cycled open. She couldn't see them directly, those systems were still down, but she knew the procedure by heart. The retrieval pod would deploy, touch down on the moon's surface, and the team would disembark to locate Elric. It should have been routine. But nothing about this situation was routine anymore. Anything yet? She asked, not taking her eyes off the console. Nora hesitated. Wait. I'm getting something. It's faint, but, a burst of static crackled through the bridge speakers. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but then it grew louder. Arden leaned forward, gripping the edge of the console. Through the static, she could hear Elric's voice. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't panicked. He was talking. Can't understand, his voice said, distorted but audible. It's alive. It's not just energy. It's thinking. Arden, did you hear that? Nora asked. I heard it, Arden said, her throat dry. Elric, this is Arden. If you can hear me, stay where you are. Teller's coming to get you. Just stay put. Elric's voice continued, unresponsive to her words. It's showing me things. Colors, patterns. I can't explain it. It's beautiful. Keep him talking, Teller's voice cut in, muffled and distant. We're approaching the site. Arden took a steadying breath. Elric, listen to me. You need to come back inside. Whatever you're seeing, it's not safe. Do you understand? You're in danger. The static wavered, and for a moment, Arden thought he might have heard her. But then his voice came through again, softer, almost detached. I think, it's trying to communicate. It's not hostile. It's just, alone. Arden's mind raced. Was he right? Was the object, or the entity, or whatever it was, actually alive? Was it reaching out, trying to make contact? If so, why had it disrupted their systems? Why had it pulled Elric into its grasp? On the console, the status lights flickered. Teller and his team were now at the site. She couldn't see them, but she could imagine them stepping cautiously into the dim light, their boots crunching the moon's regolith. She could imagine Teller's steady voice, directing the team as they fanned out, scanning the area. Teller, can you see him? She asked into the comm. Not yet, came his reply. There's some kind of distortion out here. The light's playing tricks on the surface. Keep looking. He's there. And then, suddenly, the comms cleared for just a moment, as if the interference had parted. Teller's voice was sharp and clear. I see him. He's just standing there. But the object, its static cut him off again. Arden gritted her teeth, slamming her fist against the console. Teller, repeat that. What's happening? No response. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Arden clenched her fists, resisting the urge to yell into the comm then, finally, Teller's voice broke through. We've got him. He's not responding, but he's alive. We're bringing him back now. Relief washed over Arden, but it was fleeting. Get back here fast. I don't like what's happening to our systems. The longer you're out there, the more. A sudden surge of static made her wince, and then Teller's voice returned, tight and strained. Arden, you need to see this. The object, it's moving. Her heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, moving? It's growing. Spreading. We need to move. Now. Get out of there. Arden yelled. Get back to the pod and return to the Aegis immediately. We're on it, Teller replied. We've got Elric. Hang tight. The comms went silent again, leaving Arden to stare at the console, her pulse pounding in her ears. The strange resonance in the ship hadn't stopped. If anything, it was intensifying. The walls seemed to hum with an otherworldly vibration, and shadows flickered at the edges of her vision. She pushed the fear aside. Teller was bringing Elric back. They just had to hold on a little longer. Minutes felt like hours as the Aegis crew waited for the retrieval team's return. Arden's knuckles were white as she gripped the console, her eyes glued to the flickering readouts. Teller's voice had gone silent again, leaving her and Nora with nothing but their imaginations to fill the void. We should have heard from them by now, Nora said, her voice low. The young technician kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. They'll be back, Arden replied, more to convince herself than Nora. It's just the interference. They'll be back. But deep down, Arden wasn't so sure. The strange vibrations running through the ship felt almost sentient now, as if the Aegis itself had become infected by the object's presence. The shadows in the corners of the room no longer held still, they seemed to shift and crawl when no one was looking directly at them. "Arden," Nora said, her voice trembling. "I think something's happening to the ship." "What do you mean?" Arden asked sharply. "I don't know, just, everything feels wrong." Nora's fingers danced across her console as she tried to stabilize their systems. The power fluctuations, the heat levels, even the air pressure, they're all drifting off normal. Arden frowned, her mind racing. It might be the object's field. If it's spreading, before she could finish, the intercom crackled to life. "Aegis, this is Teller. We're approaching the airlock." Arden let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "What's your status?" "We've got Elric." "He's unresponsive, but he's alive," Teller said, his voice tense. "The object, it changed again after we moved him. It started emitting a low-frequency pulse. I've never seen anything like it." "Get inside now," Arden ordered. "We'll figure out what's happening once you're safely aboard." Teller acknowledged, and the seconds crawled by until the airlock status lights on Arden's console turned green. She rushed to the airlock bay, arriving just as Teller's team stepped through. They carried Elric on a stretcher, his body limp but intact. His suit showed no visible breaches, yet there was a faint glow clinging to the surface, like the residue of the object's light. "Put him in medical," Arden said, motioning toward the infirmary. "What happened out there?" Teller's face was grim as he followed her into the ship's main corridor. He wouldn't respond. Just stood there, staring at it. When we got close enough to grab him, the object's pulse intensified. It almost felt directed. Like it knew what we were doing. "Did it harm anyone else?" Arden asked, glancing over her shoulder at the rest of the team. "Not physically," Teller said, lowering his voice. "But I'll be honest, Arden, when that thing started pulsing, I felt something. Not pain, exactly. More like pressure. In my head. Like it was trying to communicate, or invade." Arden stopped in her tracks. "Invade? You think it's sentient?" Teller shook his head. "I don't know. All I know is that it wasn't just light and energy. It felt like it was looking at me." Arden bit her lip, considering the implications. If the object, or the entity within it, was sentient, then their situation was far more dangerous than she had anticipated. "Get cleaned up and run a full decontamination. I'll have the medical team start running tests on Elric." Teller nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Arden, whatever that thing is, it's not natural. We need to consider cutting our losses. We might not be able to handle this." "I'm not giving up yet," she said firmly. "We've come this far. We'll figure it out." But as she headed to the medical bay, her resolve was tempered by a growing sense of dread. Elric's face was pale and slack, his eyes closed. The faint glow around his suit still lingered, as if clinging to him. Arden stood beside the medics as they removed his helmet and began scanning for signs of life. "Vitals are weak," one of them reported. "Brain activity is erratic, but it's there." Arden leaned over the stretcher. "Elric. Can you hear me?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then, his eyelids fluttered. His lips moved, forming faint, incomprehensible syllables. "What is he saying?" one of the medics asked, adjusting their scanner. Arden leaned closer, straining to hear. "It sounds like," Elric's voice was barely audible, but the words sent a chill down her spine. "It's awake." Elric's faint words hung in the air, heavy and chilling. Arden glanced at the medics, her mouth dry. "Get a full neural scan. I need to know what's going on in his head, now." The medics nodded and hurried to connect Elric to the diagnostic equipment. Arden stepped back, watching as the machines lit up with lines of data. His brainwaves were erratic, spiking and dropping in irregular patterns. It was as if his mind was wrestling with something they couldn't see. "Can you stabilize him?" she asked. "We're trying," one of the medics said, eyes flicking nervously between the readouts. "But his neural activity isn't responding to the usual methods. It's like, there's interference." "Interference," Arden repeated under her breath. Her mind raced. The object's pulse had scrambled their equipment, disrupted their communications. Now it seemed it was doing the same to Elric's brain. But how? And why? She turned to Teller, who had just entered the medical bay, freshly decontaminated but looking no less troubled. "Did anything unusual happen after you found him?" Teller nodded, his expression grim. "As soon as we touched him, the object's glow intensified. It felt like a warning. And then that pressure I mentioned, it grew stronger, like it was trying to push us back." Arden frowned. "But it let you take him?" "Barely," Teller said. "It stopped pulsing when we left the area, but I can't shake the feeling that it let us go." The implications were unsettling. If the object, if this thing, was aware of their actions, then it wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was something alive, something that could make choices. Arden felt a knot of unease tightening in her chest. "Commander," one of the medics called out. "You should see this." Arden stepped back to the monitors. The neural scan showed faint but unmistakable patterns forming within the chaos of Elric's brainwaves. At first glance, it looked random. But as the seconds passed, the patterns began to repeat. Rhythmic spikes and dips, almost like language. "What is that?" Arden asked, leaning closer. "It's not a natural brainwave pattern," the medic said. "It's as if something's feeding information into his neural pathways. Something not human." Teller's jaw tightened. "You're saying the object did this to him?" The medic nodded hesitantly. "That's the only explanation that makes sense. Whatever he experienced out there, it didn't just affect him physically. It's changed something in his mind." Arden took a deep breath, trying to process what she was seeing. If the object had left some kind of imprint in Elric's brain, then it meant it was far more than just a relic. It was a communicator, a transmitter, possibly even a sentient entity attempting to make contact. But was it trying to help them, or control them? "Keep him stable," she instructed the medics. "And keep monitoring those patterns. I want to know exactly what it's trying to communicate, if that's what it's doing." As she turned away from the monitors, Teller followed her. "Arden, this is getting out of hand. If that thing can mess with people's minds, we're not equipped to handle it. We need to consider sealing it off and leaving it behind." "You saw what it did, Teller," Arden said, her voice low but firm. "If we just leave it, we're no better than the ones who abandoned it there in the first place. It's dangerous, yes. But it might also be the key to understanding something greater than ourselves. We can't turn back now. And what if it's a threat we can't contain?" Teller shot back. "What if we're bringing something on board that'll compromise the entire ship, or worse?" Arden hesitated. His concerns were valid. The object's influence was undeniable, and she had no idea how far it could reach. But her instincts told her there was more to it than pure malice. If it wanted to destroy them, it could have done so already. Instead, it seemed to be reaching out, though clumsily, chaotically. Almost as if it didn't fully understand them. "We'll keep it contained," she said at last. "And we'll study it. We won't take unnecessary risks, but we need answers, Teller. If this thing is as old and powerful as it seems, we can't just ignore it. We have a responsibility to learn what we can, for everyone's sake." Teller frowned, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he nodded toward the medical monitors. "What if Elric doesn't come back from this? What if that thing's already got its hooks in him too deep?" Arden's stomach churned. She didn't have an answer. All she could do was hope that whatever was happening in Elric's mind, it wasn't permanent, and that they could find a way to separate him from the object's influence. "Then we'll find a way to save him," she said quietly. "We have to. And we'll figure out what this thing really is, no matter what it takes." The Aegis seemed to settle into an uneasy calm, though the low, otherworldly vibration in the walls persisted. Arden stood at the edge of the medical bay, watching as the medics worked quietly around Elric's unconscious body. On the monitors, his brain activity still showed those strange, repeating patterns, something that resembled language, but no one could decipher it. Teller leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his brow furrowed. "You really think we're going to figure this out before it does more damage?" Arden sighed. "I don't know. But leaving now would mean we've learned nothing. If we can understand what it's trying to communicate, if it's even trying to communicate, then maybe we can prevent something worse from happening. Or we might be walking straight into a trap," Teller muttered. "That thing's older than any of us can imagine. Whatever its creators intended, they left it behind for a reason. Maybe it's best if it stays buried." Arden shook her head. "If we don't study it, someone else will. I'd rather it be us, at least we'll approach it carefully. We've already gotten closer to it than anyone else in who knows how long. Turning back now would leave too many unanswered questions." Teller sighed and turned away, rubbing the back of his neck. Arden knew he didn't agree, but she also knew he wouldn't abandon the mission. He was stubborn, just like her. That stubbornness was part of the reason they'd gotten this far. As the hours dragged on, the medics' efforts yielded little change in Elric's condition. His vital signs remained stable, but his mind seemed trapped somewhere beyond their reach. Arden reviewed every scrap of data they'd collected so far, hoping for some clue. The substance's pulsing field had subsided after they brought Elric aboard, but the faint resonance in the ship still lingered, as though the object had left a mark on the very structure of the Aegis. "Dr. Cross," Nora's voice came through the intercom. "You might want to come to the lab." Arden left the medical bay and hurried to the main lab, where Nora was hunched over a console. The younger technician gestured toward a screen filled with complex waveforms. "I've been analyzing the patterns in Elric's neural data. It's not random. It's repeating at intervals that match certain known frequencies." "Known frequencies?" Arden asked, stepping closer. Nora nodded. "They're not human-made, but they're similar to some deep space signals recorded by ancient exploration probes. Fragments of what might have been early alien communications. It's like the object is trying to tap into something we don't fully understand." Arden stared at the screen, her mind working through the possibilities. What if it's broadcasting, or receiving? Could this be some kind of beacon? "That's one possibility," Nora said. "But if it's a beacon, then who, or what, is it signaling? And why now?" Before Arden could respond, the lights in the lab flickered. The hum in the walls grew louder for a moment, then faded again. Nora froze, her eyes wide. "That's the third time today. I don't think it's random." Arden frowned. "What's causing it?" "I don't know," Nora admitted. "But I think the object's pulse left some sort of imprint in our systems. It's like it's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Arden asked, more to herself than to Nora. Neither of them had an answer. Back in the medical bay, Elric stirred for the first time since being brought aboard. His lips moved, his eyelids fluttered, but the words he whispered were incomprehensible. One of the medics leaned in, trying to catch what he was saying, but the sounds were garbled, alien. When Arden returned to the medical bay, one of the medics met her at the door. "He's becoming more active," the medic reported. "But we can't understand what he's saying. It's like he's speaking another language, or something that isn't a language at all." Arden approached the stretcher, looking down at Elric's pale face. His eyes were open now, though unfocused. He mumbled softly, the sounds more melodic than any human speech, yet oddly structured. Arden felt a chill. It was as if he was repeating something he had heard, something imprinted on his mind by the object. "Elric," she said quietly. "Can you hear me? Can you understand me?" He didn't respond directly, but his eyes moved, briefly meeting hers. For an instant, there was a flicker of recognition before his gaze drifted away again. He muttered a few more unintelligible phrases, then fell silent once more. "We need to figure out what that thing did to him," Arden said, turning to the medics. "Keep monitoring his vitals and record everything he says. Even if we don't understand it now, we might later." One of the medics nodded. "Understood, Dr. Cross." Arden stepped back, her mind spinning. The object had touched Elric's mind, that much was clear. But why? What was it trying to convey? She couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something incredible, or something catastrophic. For now, all they could do was wait, watch, and listen. In the days that followed, the Aegis fell into an uneasy rhythm. Elric's condition slowly improved, though he remained groggy and disoriented, his words still slipping between human language and the strange melodic tones that seemed to echo in his mind. Arden and the crew worked tirelessly to decipher the patterns in his speech, poring over their data and comparing it to ancient records from early deep space probes. It wasn't until Nora stumbled on a fragment of an ancient alien transmission that things began to make sense. The fragment, barely a snippet of sound recorded by a long-lost exploratory drone, contained a series of tones remarkably similar to the ones coming from Elric. Arden and Nora spent hours matching the patterns, and though it was far from a complete translation, a message began to emerge. "It's not a warning," Nora said, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and disbelief. "It's a plea. The object isn't threatening us. It's asking for help." Arden stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. "Help? From us?" Nora nodded. "It's incomplete, but the essence of the message is clear. The object, or rather, the intelligence tied to it, isn't malicious. It's alone. It's been abandoned, left behind after its creators disappeared. And it's been trying to reach out for centuries." The implications were staggering. Arden felt the weight of the discovery settle over her shoulders. The substance they had feared, the mysterious, dangerous object that had caused so much chaos, wasn't a weapon or a trap. It was a beacon of loneliness, a fragment of a long-dead civilization reaching out into the void, searching for understanding. Arden stood from her console and looked out the viewport. The barren moon's surface stretched before her, stark and silent. The object still rested out there, unmoving, but its presence now felt different. It wasn't an enemy. It was a survivor. "We have a choice," Arden said, more to herself than anyone else. "We can leave it here, turn our backs, and pretend we never found it. Or, we can try to help." Teller, who had been listening quietly, folded his arms. "And how do you propose we do that? It's not like we can fix something that ancient, let alone communicate with it properly." Arden turned to him, her gaze steady. "We don't have to fix it. We just have to acknowledge it. Maybe that's all it needs, someone to recognize that it's still here, that it's not forgotten." Teller's expression softened, and he gave a small nod. "If we can do that without putting the entire crew at risk, I'll back you. Just be sure it's not some trap." "It's not a trap," Arden said firmly. "It's lonely. And I think we've all felt that at some point." She returned to the medical bay, where Elric had finally begun to recover his strength. He sat up slowly, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. Arden sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Elric," she said gently. "What do you remember?" He looked at her, his expression weary but calm. "It wasn't angry," he said quietly. "It was scared. It showed me, memories, maybe. Of when it was first created, when it had a purpose. But then its creators left. They left it behind. It's been waiting ever since. Arden nodded. We think it's asking for help. Elric closed his eyes, his breathing slow and measured. It doesn't want much. Just to be heard. To be known. Arden squeezed his hand. We're going to do that. We'll let it know it's not alone anymore. Over the next several days, the crew carefully transmitted their findings back to their central command, explaining the nature of the object and its message. They didn't attempt to move it or alter it. Instead, they sent a series of simple, heartfelt signals. They acknowledged the object's presence. They let it know that someone had heard its call after all these centuries. And then, slowly, the strange hum that had reverberated through the Aegis began to fade. The ship's systems stabilized. The shadows stopped shifting. Whatever bond the object had formed with them seemed to release, as if it had finally found peace. As the Aegis prepared to leave the barren moon behind, Arden stood on the bridge and watched the object's faint glow recede into the distance. It hadn't attacked them, hadn't sought revenge. All it had wanted was to be acknowledged, to be understood. And in doing so, it had reminded them all of something profoundly human, the need for connection, the desire to know that even in the vast, cold emptiness of space, no one had to be truly alone. And with that, the Aegis set its course for home, carrying a story unlike any other, a story of fear turned to understanding, and of the simple, powerful act of listening.